just make very clear at the beginning I am not an attorney and have not had a distinguished legal career, or an undistinguished one for that matter. What I have done is, since 1979, I have worked with the U.S. Army in particular and the national security system at large, and I'm currently the longest serving teacher in the senior military for 1- and 2-star officers. I've been teaching courses for 21 years on the art of war, and I helped found the Military Reform Caucus and helped testify at the hearings which led to the Goldwater-Nichols bill, which one could argue began one of the first large institutional changes that leads towards the future military. I wanted to come today and told Doug I'd be very privileged to be able to come and introduce him, because I think that Douglas McGregor is in a tradition which goes back to Alfred Thayer Mahan and to Billy Mitchell and to John Boyd. This is a tradition in which ideas really matter. They matter far more in the military than non-military people normally appreciate. Mahan's concepts of naval power decisively shaped the British, American navies in the First World War, German Navy, in ways that were truly historic, and you could argue that from a U.S. naval standpoint, that Mahan 100 years later is still the dominant intellectual shaper of how they think about strategy. Now, Billy Mitchell was the first really large-scale operational air officer in the American military, and by 1918 he had really come to understand the potential for air power. His works in the 1920s are so profoundly far-reaching that you could argue virtually every aspect of the American Air Force up through the mid-1990s was a reflection of his writing. And he really got all the major components, and in fact had begun to design a 1919 air campaign, which was literally the precursor of what would happen in the Second World War. And the Army Air Corps, which became the Air Force in many ways, stood on Mitchell's shoulders and was shaped by him. John Boyd, a retired Air Force colonel, developed an entire theory of war around the notion of observe, orient, decide, and act, and then loop back. And that model of very rapid information acquisition, making decisions, moving on the decisions, and then checking reality again, in many ways is the core model that the Army used in designing airland battle doctrine and shaped the emergence of the modern American military. So ideas really matter. Doug McGregor, coming out of a superb combat background, with real understanding of what happens at the point of contact, began developing, in an earlier book, Breaking the Phalanx, an understanding of the cultural and organizational inhibitors to large-scale transformation. Transformation is actually not about technology. It's about the use of technology in cultural and institutional settings. It's important to remember the French had more tanks than the Germans in 1940, and you could argue they had better tanks. What the French didn't have was a doctrine and a training practice of armored warfare and the use of the radio in the tank and in connection with the dive bomber to create a fist that could break through and create mobile warfare. You could argue that we actually have more technological transformation than we have organizational and cultural transformation, and that how you really measure that in the combat arms is by looking at how we organize and how we train for combat. And in my experience in the last decade, Doug McGregor comes closer to understanding how profound the underlying changes will be. And I think that as you watch what's happening right now, as we begin to rethink the Army for the next 15 years, I think you'll see lots of conversations about how we can get units. I happen to read this, I think it's the head of TRADOC who recently was talking about the importance of packaging units in an ad hoc way, sort of like battle groups, and things that come almost directly out of Breaking the Phalanx. His new work, Transformation Under Fire, I think is very responsive to where the President and Secretary Rumsfeld have tried to carry the system. And I think for every ground combat officer and every person in the air and naval services who's interested in how ground combat will evolve, this book should be must reading. And I certainly hope with the new Chief of Staff of the Army that this book will emerge rapidly as one of the must-reading books for the people who are working with him. So I think Doug has been a real patriot, a man who has risked his life for his country, a man who's had the courage to fight inside the peacetime bureaucracies, and a man who's had the courage to put his ideas down in writing where others can fire at him. So in that tradition, I'm going to give you a chance to be fired at. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, let me just say something about Newt Gingrich. Anybody who has spent time with Newt knows that this is someone who loves the United States Armed Forces and the Army, I would argue, most especially. And it's precisely that kind of love that comes from outside the Armed Forces and outside the United States Army that is very much needed today. And as I will talk a little bit about the criticality of civilian leadership and how civilian leadership figures very prominently in fundamental change in military affairs. So Newt's role in this is much larger and of infinitely greater magnitude than many of you realize, and I hope that that will be appreciated. In fact, one can argue that he will have had as profound an impact on the armed forces perhaps as he's had on the nation at large. We're all familiar with his earlier revolution, and I like to think that he's part of this new revolution that we're trying to launch today.